Channell is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Channell, were you talking to me? You're just talking. Dr. Channell earned her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Alabama in 2012. Following her PhD, she spent 3 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Davis Mind Institute, funded under the NRSA Postdoctoral Training Program grant from the NIH. She joined the faculty in the Department of Speech and Hearing Science at the University of Illinois in 2015. Dr. Channell's research focuses on the development of language, cognition, and social emotional skills in individuals with Down syndrome and other disorders associated with intellectual disabilities, particularly during the middle childhood and adolescence. The overarching goal of her work is to characterize the development of skills that support everyday communication in these individuals in order to identify optimal strategies for supporting their social and academic success. Dr. Laura Hahn joined the faculty at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 2015. Dr. Hahn received her PhD in Education and Human Development from Colorado State University in 2012, where she served as a project and lab coordinator for the CSU Developmental Disabilities Research Lab. Following her PhD, she spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the Lifespan Institute at the University of Kansas, funded under an NRSA postdoctoral training grant from NIH in translational research in intellectual and developmental disabilities, where she worked on the Family Adaptation to Fragile X project. She also completed a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship with Neurodevelopmental Disorders Project at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Hahn's research focuses on the emergence of early social, cognitive, and communicative abilities, including characterizing syndrome-specific patterns of early development, as well as describing the trajectories and cascading effect of early developmental strengths and weaknesses on later outcomes in infants and young children with neurogenic disorders such as Fragile X, Down syndrome, and Williams syndrome. The ultimate goal of her research is to translate findings to support the development of early interventions aimed at promoting well-being and positive development. So welcome, Dr. Hahn and Dr. Channell. Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you, Stephanie, for that excellent description. As you can tell, we not only have complicated research goals, they have long words, and we have very lofty goals. So as she said, I'm Dr. Laura Hahn, and she's already given a great sort of overview of our focus for each of us. But just to summarize, really our ultimate goal is to promote positive development. And so my research focuses on these early patterns of social, cognitive, and communicative development and looking at their trajectories over time and how they affect later skills. And Dr. Channell really focuses on how language, cognition, and social emotional skills impact communication development in the school age years and looking at how communication impacts post-school outcomes. Our goal with doing this line of work is to someday develop interventions for these areas. So just to sort of give you a little context, our approach really focuses on understanding development in Down syndrome based on the idea of a behavioral phenotype. So a behavioral phenotype is a measurable behavioral outcome that's observed in individuals with neurogenetic disorders and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So how this works is that we have a given syndrome, and it can be anything. It can also be just any person, okay? And so these genetic predispositions are going to give rise to a certain set of behavioral outcomes. So they can be cognitive, they can be linguistic, social, emotional, and motoric. But the big thing here that you all know and we know is that while we have these sort of sets of patterns that we see in individuals, that doesn't mean that we'll see these patterns in all individuals with a given syndrome. So we tend to sort of talk about things in terms of relative strengths and weaknesses to highlight that there is this individual variability, but we do see some patterns that emerge in these skill sets. So when we're looking at early development in Down syndrome, it's very interesting, but there's actually sort of limited research in this area. So most of the studies that focus on infant development are from the 80s and 90s. And we have had some recent studies that have been put on by Stephanie Sherman and her team that do look at broad developmental outcomes, especially in looking at certain medical conditions. So heart defects have been examined a lot. But we don't really know a lot about early development. Also, the studies that we have are pretty limited, so they tend to focus sort of on very small groups of children, so 10 or less infants. They're very descriptive, which is very helpful, but doesn't tell us a lot about how they're developing over time. And some of the reports actually conflict with what we are seeing later in development. So, for example, there is some research that indicates early looking behavior in infants with Down syndrome to their caregivers starts out as delayed, and then it increases over time, and then there's some impairments in joint attention. And that's that beautiful where your infant looks at a toy, they look back at you, and they look at the toy, and they smile to show you they're interested in it. When we look later in development, we actually see that joint attention is mentally age appropriate. So, and it's also seen as a skill, something they're good at. So what's happening? Why is there this difference that we're seeing in these infant studies to these preschool studies? So kind of trying to figure out, why is there this conflict? When we go to early childhood, we start to have a really clear picture. So there's a lot more research on our 2 to 5-year-olds, and we know that we have this behavioral phenotype. We know it's starting to emerge around 2. We don't know yet if it's emerging before 2. And so we see that we have some really clear strengths. So we have strengths in social functioning, especially early social interest, things like joint attention, smiling, affect, all of those things that we're kind of familiar with. Some of our recent studies have also shown that children with Down syndrome who are minimally verbal, so about less than 20 words, use eye gaze very frequently to communicate. And specifically, I'm talking about 3-point eye gaze, so looking at you, looking at an object, and looking back to communicate a want or an interest. And so this is also part of these strengths in nonverbal communication. So using eye gaze and gestures to communicate needs and wants. And this coincides with their strength in receptive language, so understanding, especially when we see some difficulties with expressive language. Those nonverbal communication skills are really vital. We also have some new evidence on our infants with Down syndrome that we're just getting, where we're seeing these sort of strengths in emotion and eye gaze are emerging between 9 and 12 months. And the infants with Down syndrome are actually performing slightly higher than their same age typically developing peers. So it's a very strong strength that we're seeing early. When we look at expressive language, we see that we have some delays even in babbling, early vocalization, and first words. First words can emerge anywhere from about a year to 6 years. So there's a very wide range. We don't have a lot of information yet on what are the contributors to this range and how to sort of help reduce this wide range. We also know there's some weaknesses in task persistence, especially when presented with a very challenging task. We see a sort of fight to continue that task, an increase in off-task behavior, and this actually has led to the realization that there's a very specific motivation profile in Down syndrome that is socially based. So in these taxing situations, we see an increase of social skills to sort of distract others from that hard task. So if I am challenging a child during a task, suddenly they're going to start smiling at me, they're going to direct me to the window and start talking to me about the weather, right? As if I'm going to completely forget that I need them to finish this task, as I'm sure most of you know. So we have a really great sense of what's happening in preschool. But what does this mean for the behavioral phenotype? We have clear evidence at 2, but when is it starting? How early do we see this? This is one of my big questions I'm working on. As well as, how early is it starting? How is it developing over time and having this cascading influence onto other areas of development? So language is very important. These social skills are important, and they're going to impact other things down the road. So how do I begin to address this question? This was what I was stuck with. Well, I need to do prospective studies that start in infancy and follow children out into early childhood, into middle childhood, and beyond. So we know where are we starting, how is it developing, and where we're going. So this will lead to sort of a better understanding of overall development and allow us to identify areas for intervention targets, maybe that we haven't known about, and areas we can use to support those interventions, and really sort of have the strongest support system in place for early intervention. So with that note, I'm going to transfer it over to Marie to talk about middle childhood.
So Dr. Hahn and I make a very good team because when she's finished with the babies and the toddlers and the young kids, she can just hand them off to me and I can track them through middle childhood and adolescence. Unlike in infancy, where Dr. Hahn was telling you there's not a lot of research, most of the research on the behavioral phenotype of Down syndrome has focused on the school-age years and adolescence. So we actually have quite a bit of literature to cover, and I promise I'm not covering it all today. I'm just summarizing a few of the highlights in this chart here. So what we know about this is that we see, like Dr. Hahn said, some relative strengths and relative challenges within each domain of functioning that we look at. So for example, if you look at the cognitive, the row there that represents the cognitive domain, we see relative strengths in visuospatial processing and visual memory, with relative challenges in auditory processing and memory. And then even relative to the cognitive delays, language is typically even more delayed for individuals with Down syndrome, but because language is not a unitary ability, we still see this pattern of relative strengths in receptive language and vocabulary, and relative challenges in expressive language, particularly in the area of syntax or grammar. And then social emotional skills tend to be a relative strength in individuals with Down syndrome, even through middle childhood and into adolescence, and particularly with things like social engagement, motivation, approaching other people, as well as nonverbal aspects of communication, eye contact, facial expressions, gestures. But we still, if we look at the domain of social cognition, we still see that as a relative challenge. So social cognition is the mental processing of social information when we interact with other people. For example, taking someone else's perspective, being able to consider how someone else may be thinking or feeling when it differs from ourselves. So even though I'm saying that we think that's a relative challenge for individuals with Down syndrome, there's very, very little research in this area, and that's one of the gaps that I am trying to fill with my work. Okay, what I presented in the last slide, we have that information from studies of the average performance of groups of individuals with Down syndrome. But as you all know, I don't have to tell you this, that there's a lot of inter-individual variation from one individual with Down syndrome to the next. So that's why I wanted to include this slide. So this graph here represents, it's from a study of mine from a couple of years ago, and it represents individuals with Down syndrome who we tracked over a 3-year period across adolescence. And a couple of things I want to point out. So first of all, across the bottom there is chronological age, and then the vertical axis represents raw abilities of a test of nonverbal cognition. So if we look at nonverbal cognition, every single line represents one individual with Down syndrome. And I think this really shows you how messy the data are. And so that's the first thing I wanted to point out. But the second thing I want to point out is if you do look sort of at the big picture holistically, you can see a general trend where you see an increase. You see the diagonal increase there, and that just represents gaining abilities over time. And I think this is really important because it reminds us to think about trajectories of development and how that changes over time instead of just looking at single time points with our research. So I told you what we know, and we know quite a bit about the phenotype within the school-age years, but there's still some important things we don't know. So most of the research so far has focused on one domain of functioning over time, looking at patterns within that, say, nonverbal cognition, or patterns within language. But very little research has really started to put together those different domains, so looking at cognitive skills, language skills, and social skills, and how they all come together to impact something like communication. So our first question is, how does the phenotype impact everyday communication? Because we know we need all of those skills to be able to communicate with other people. Our other big question is what accounts for that inter-individual variation I just showed you in the last slide. And these are really important questions if we're going to be developing interventions that are more targeted, more specific, and that can be sort of customized for the individual depending on where that individual is developmentally. So with my work, I'm really aiming to look at cognition, language, and social skills, and how individuals with Down syndrome use these skills or apply them in everyday kinds of communication contexts. And one nice example that I will highlight for us today is through something we call narrative storytelling. This is being able to tell a story to someone else, talk about a sequence of events that have happened in the past. And if you stop and you think about it for a second, we actually use narrative storytelling all the time. That's a primary way in which we communicate and connect with other people. We tell them about something that happened to me on the way here today, something I heard about at this great, wonderful conference today on Down syndrome, something we read about recently or we saw in a recent movie. So this is a primary way for us to communicate. Narrative, I'm just going to point out here also, narrative ability is highly related to literacy because there's research that shows that our ability to understand story structures helps us comprehend stories that we read. So, even though we tell stories all the time, I don't think much of you, at least I didn't before I started this work, really spend a lot of time thinking about what goes into a good story. And it's actually quite a complex skill. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the points here. So, in the domain of cognition, one must be able to mentally organize the event sequences in a logical order and plan what they're about to say to convey the message that they want to communicate. And in the language domain, it really requires more complex sentence structure, syntax, and really precise vocabulary to communicate things like the order of events, first, then, next, etc., or things like cause and effect. To communicate causality, it requires a little bit higher level of language to be able to do that. And then socio-emotionally, to tell an engaging story, which is all what we want to do, we don't want people falling asleep on us, we need to be able to do a lot of things, but one of those things is to take the perspective of the story characters. So talk about why those characters are acting, what are their intentions, what are their goals, their motivations, and then how did they react? How did it make them feel? What did they think about it? Giving that extra information really helps to tell a more engaging story where we connect with other people. And so that's one of the primary areas that I'm focusing on right now with my research. So I'm really just starting to put all of this together. So we have, like I said before, we have some information on how they're doing cognitively and in language and in social-emotional skills. And now we want to see how they all come together and apply it to a context. For example, narrative storytelling. Now, this is not the only communication context. We could look at this in conversation or through play and other things. But when I'm looking at school-age individuals and teenagers, we need some way of measuring communication in a context that is age-appropriate for a really wide age range and that can capture abilities that may be varying from just speaking in maybe 2-3 word sentences and simple stories all the way to telling adult-like complex stories. And this kind of task allows us to do this. So what we do in our research with narrative storytelling is we have our research participants tell a story. We prompt them to tell a story to the examiner, and we record their narratives, and then we go back later and we code their narratives for different kinds of content, for the linguistic features, for the vocabulary and the grammar, but also for things like the story structure, the order of the events, the discussion of character perspectives, and so on. So That is one, like I said, one way that we can measure communication. Not the only way, but it's really great because also it can bypass a lot of the issues that we see with traditional tests of sort of standardized tests of language or other aspects of communication, and we can get a lot of information from a little bit of time, so that's really nice. Okay, in the interest of time, I will go ahead and wrap up here. And the way I want to conclude this is to emphasize that Dr. Hahn and I both really want to promote positive development. So we want to address some of these gaps that we currently have in the research. We told you some ways that we're doing that. And we are currently collecting data on several studies. I will just very briefly mention each one. You have flyers in your packets that tell you a little bit more about these studies as well. But these are examples of how we're trying to address these gaps, and I'm hoping that you guys can stay tuned, and sometime in the future, maybe, if they like us, they'll invite us back. You guys will invite us back here, and we can present some of the results from this work. So the first study is called Early Development in Down Syndrome, and I'm sure you can guess this is Dr. Hahn's. And so this is characterizing early development in starting at 12 months. And then one of my studies is spoken language development in Down syndrome. So this is characterizing how individuals are telling narratives, as well as how mother-child interactions may be helping to support children's telling of narratives in the school-age years, 6 to 11-year-olds right now. And then the Down Syndrome Cognition Project is our partnership with Emory University's Down Syndrome 360 that Dr. Sherman already told you about. So Dr. Hahn and I have just started Illinois as a site to collect data on that project as well, to really characterize some of that wide variation in cognitive abilities that I showed you back at the beginning. And then I just want to tell you that very soon I will be starting up a study that looks at how these skills impact outcomes once individuals transition from the school system into community-based adult services. And so this study is actually going to be an online survey for parents because I want to hear from parents about their experiences through this process of transition. So I'm hoping to launch this by the end of the summer, so definitely stay tuned for that. And with that note, I will share our contact information. This is also in the slide, the handout that you have of the different slides. The very last slide gives you our contact information, so you can go to our websites and check out the most recent research findings. And also, if you have any questions at any time, we love to hear from you guys. We could not do any of this without parents and families like you. So we really do want to hear what you have to say and hear from you. Very quickly, because research takes a village, I just want to acknowledge our many students from both of our labs at the University of Illinois who work tirelessly every single day to make sure things run smoothly for us in our research. And thank you most of all for your time, for your attention, and for contributing to our research. We couldn't do it without you. Dr. Hahn and I will be around this afternoon, so feel free to grab us if you have any questions. If you don't end up getting a chance to talk to us, please, like I said, reach out, call us, email us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.